Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to our BMS webinar. My name is Kara McMullen, and as you all know, I'm the project manager for the Burn Model System National Data and Statistical Center. So I'm going to introduce Andrew, and then he's going to take it away and present on confounders and statistical analyses. So Andrew Humbert is the co-principal investigator of the Burn Model System National Data and Statistical Center. He is also an assistant professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine with 10 years of experience in study design and data analysis in various medical settings. He has conducted analyses from a wide variety of data sources, including clinical trials, medical records, survey data, and large data registries, and has extensive experience using regression techniques for a wide range of data types, including longitudinal, clustered, and survival data. He also provides statistical support for the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine. So Andrew, take it away.
Great, thank you, Kara. Happy to keep this kind of presentation, somewhat informal. So feel free, interrupt me at any point if there are kind of questions. I'll try to keep an eye on chat or kind of look for hands raised. But if I'm not catching, if I'm not catching anything, just feel free to kind of shout out and just verbally interrupt me. I'd kind of rather, have questions answered as we go along than kind of, leave till the end and have people confused and then try to kind of go back and figure out kind of where people got lost. So at any point, feel free to interrupt. As Kara said, today the focus is really going to be kind of talking about confounders and statistical analyses. So I've kind of broken down into kind of three areas, kind of, the what is a confounder? So what do we mean when we're actually talking about confounders from a statistical sense? Why do we care about confounders? And then kind of ultimately, how do we address confounding when we're thinking about study design or data analyses? So the outline for this talk is going to be, just starting with a motivating example, ice cream and sharks, just kind of keeping it light, but it's an example that comes up quite a bit if you just kind of Google search confounding or, correlations and causations. So it's an example that's, very present out there. And it does a really good job of illustrating, what confounding is and kind of the potential issues with confounding and why it does need to be addressed. I'll then briefly try to formalize those concepts. So, we're not getting into, detailed textbook definitions here, but trying to put it in a little more formalized kind of definition than just using ice cream and sharks. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at an applied example, using with data from the Burn Model Systems National Longitudinal Database. And that I'm hoping, I know it's a small group, I don't want to put too much pressure on individuals, but I'm hoping there will be some discussion on kind of how we should build this model, because I think, confounding really is a discussion that needs to be had. It's not just kind of clear-cut statistician makes the call. This is really it's clinical information, it's statistical information. It's really the combination of a lot of different kind of knowledge that needs to come together to make these decisions. So I'm hoping by kind of having a discussion, we can kind of promote that idea of, really critically thinking about confounding rather than just kind of, oh, we should include this, we should include that kind of willy-nilly. So again, starting with that, motivating example, shark attacks and ice cream. It's well documented that shark attacks are kind of much more frequent when ice cream sales are much higher. So kind of stealing this figure from Statology, they give a few different examples of kind of correlations and causations, but this is the example of basically ice cream sales and shark attacks. And we see that these trajectories are very, very similar. The red line is shark attacks, the blue is ice cream, and we see kind of starting from January up until June and July, we see this very steady increase in both ice cream sales as well as shark attacks. Once we kind of get to June and July, and even kind of past August, we then see that trend is reversed, and we're seeing that ice cream sales and shark attacks are both kind of decreasing until we get to kind of that low in that December, January, that kind of midwinter time period. So, I think a very cursory look at this, you say, whoa, there must be some sort of relationship here. Either, people eating ice cream is causing shark attacks, or shark attacks are causing people, to eat ice cream. But, I think if we really kind of critically think about, does eating ice cream actually increase your, chance of being attacked by a shark? I think that would be a hard sell for a lot of individuals. Possibly eating ice cream makes you a little sweeter. The sharks can smell that on you, and they are more prone to attack you. I mean, you could probably come up with some far-fetched claims as to why that could be. But again, I think those are pretty far-fetched claims, and I think most people probably wouldn't put too much credit into that kind of line of thought. So the question is, really, why are these two related then? We see this very, very clear trend. If we think there probably isn't really a causal relationship between eating ice cream and getting attacked by a shark, what's going on here? So this is the first chance for a little bit of audience participation. Again, I'll just give it a few seconds if anybody wants to chime in, but I'm not going to put too much pressure on this group. But if anyone does want to volunteer, what could be one thought on why these two look related, even if, they're not causing each other? Feel free to chime in or type in chat. Again, I'll give it a few seconds. If no one responds, I'll just move through. Yeah, I'm seeing the summer months here. Yeah, that's again, we don't know for sure, but that's a perfectly reasonable explanation for what's going on here, right? People tend to eat more ice cream in the summer, when it's hotter. People tend to swim more when it's the summer and it's hotter. So there's just more chance for shark attacks because there's just more people in the water. Possibly something to do with any kind of, migrational patterns with sharks. I don't know enough about that, if that's, a factor for the summer months, but certainly there's just more people in the water, more people in the ocean, more people who are just simply going to be exposed to sharks, just more opportunities for attacks. And we're certainly, I think you see a very strong relationship between summer months and people buying and consuming ice cream. It's a lot less appealing to me right now in Seattle with kind of the colder, rainy weather, but in that hot summer, that ice cream does sound really good. So yeah, that's probably what's going on here. We're probably seeing that essentially the season or weather is confounding this relationship between ice cream sales and shark attacks. Again, it's not that ice cream sales are causing shark attacks. It's this other variable that's leading to an increase in both ice cream sales, hotter weather, higher ice cream sales, and shark attacks, hotter weather, more people swimming, more chance for shark attacks. So kind of, I think the next natural question then is, if we were really interested in determining if ice cream sales do cause shark attacks, we need some way to account for this fact that weather and kind of the season is impacting both of these. So how can we essentially eliminate the effect of weather or seasonality to be able to try to conclude if ice cream sales are indeed, causally related to shark attacks? Again, weather is probably some component, but is there a component that's left where ice cream sales really are causing those shark attacks? So, we want to assess the association while controlling for seasonal, temperature. So, what would be one way that we could theoretically do this? Again, just give a few seconds if anybody wants to kind of chime in with any ideas. It doesn't have to be something you could actually implement, in the real world. But, if you had complete control over everything, would there be any way that we could kind of set this up to assess if ice cream sales affect shark attacks after kind of controlling for the season or the weather? Well, hearing none, I'll just kind of go through it. I'm not going to hold everyone as accountable as like a lecture here, but essentially what we want to do is we want to hold the season and temperature constant, right? If we hold that season and temperature constant, again, if we're only looking in warm days in the summer, there's no way that temperature can have an impact on the ice cream sales within that time period. If the weather's always the same, the weather's not going to have an impact from one day to the other. So what we'd want to do is we want to be able to fix temperature constant, fix that season constant. And then if we could, we want to intentionally vary ice cream sales. Some days we decide we're going to sell a lot of ice cream, and other days we're going to intentionally limit the amount of ice cream that's sold so that we get that variance in that ice cream sales. And then we can see the days that we kind of withheld ice cream and refused to sell, are shark attacks lower on those days, or are we seeing that it's not really related at all, and that regardless of whether we withhold ice cream sales or not, the shark attacks remain relatively constant? Again, is this actually possible to do? I think you'd be hard pressed to kind of get all the ice cream vendors and say, this week I want you guys to just not sell any ice cream and just completely lose that business. It's not feasible to implement this study, but this is the idea of what we want to do when we want to try to address confounding. Is we want to be able to control that potential confounder and see, is there still a relationship between our predictor of interest, in this case ice cream sales, and our outcome, shark attacks? So that was, again, just kind of that motivating example, trying to kind of set up, what does confounding look like? A little bit of the what, a little bit of the why, a little bit of the how, but now trying to formalize that a little bit. Again, not textbook definitions, but giving a little more rigorous kind of understanding of what confounders are and what we need to think about when we're considering confounding in our analyses. So, what really is a confounder? And in its most kind of simple definition, it's really just a variable that causes a spurious relationship between two other variables. And this is, I think this definition is slightly misleading in that we often kind of fixate on the causing a spurious relationship, but a confounder can also kind of cause a sort of like a relationship to look that like it doesn't exist spuriously. So it can both induce a relationship, but it can also take away a relationship. So it's possible a confounder is removing a relationship that's actually there. So it's not just causing a spurious relationship to be present, it could be causing a kind of spuriously a relationship to be removed as well. And I think that's often overlooked when we consider confounding, but it's a very important thing to note as well. We're not just including it to try to remove a relationship, we might also be including it to see what relationship appears because the confounder could be kind of masking a relationship that's actually present. Okay, in our setting, this is really, does weather make it appear as if ice cream sales cause shark attacks? We see this very clear trend between ice cream sales and shark attacks. So we're kind of worried that a confounder is maybe causing that spurious relationship to occur. In a more kind of statistical sense, what we really want when we're considering a confounder are basically two different relationships to exist in our data. The first is that confounder really needs to be associated with the predictor of interest. So we need to have a relationship there for it to truly be confounding. So if the weather was not related to ice cream sales, we can basically conclude that weather cannot be a confounder. That has to be met. It doesn't need to be causal, but there just needs to be a relationship there. As weather goes up, ice cream sales go up, whether it's causal, which in our case it probably is, or whether it's not. But what we do need is that confounder to be causally associated with the outcome. So we really do need to believe that confounder is causing this outcome to happen. And in this case, that weather, that seasonality is causing shark attacks, not necessarily directly, not just because it's warmer, but because that warmer weather is changing people's habits, but that's still sort of this causal pathway. Warmer weather leads to more people swimming, which then in turn leads to more exposures to shark, which and then leads to more shark attacks. So it doesn't have to be a direct link. There can be an indirect path, but we have to think that there is a causal path there somewhere. And these are all often thought of as kind of more theoretical conceptual models, right? We're not able to actually test if a confounder is causally associated with the outcome, but it's something that we tend to kind of believe ahead of time. We kind of, based on previous literature, previous studies, other types of associations that have been analyzed, or even just conceptual models, biologically, does this make sense that this could cause something to occur? It's, again, not something we test. It's something that we really need to kind of discuss and think about ahead of time and conclude, does this actually make sense that it would meet these criteria or not? And this is where these direct acyclic graphs can really be helpful. So in a nutshell, it's basically just a graph that kind of outlines different associations between different variables. So this is a very kind of simple graph looking at, what does it look like to be a confounder if we're drawing these kind of figures? So our first bubble, we have that predictor of interest. And what we really want to know, I have a question here. Will you please comment on how it cannot be in the causal pathway, but it has to be, causally associated. So it doesn't have to be causally associated with the predictor of interest. So it only has to be sort of in the causal pathway from confounder to the outcome, not necessarily from the confounder to the predictor of interest. So that just has to be association. There could be something else that's causing both of those, and that causes that association, but it might not be a direct causal trend for that. But we do want it to be, again, kind of in that causal pathway from confounder to outcome. We want that to kind of occur. So again, what we really want to know is this line going from predictor of interest to our outcome. And we're kind of hoping this is causal. Again, we don't necessarily know it's causal, but we're hoping to try to analyze and get a clear trend of this is a very real association we're analyzing here. But what this confounder essentially looks like in this model is we have this kind of solid arrow pointing to outcome, indicating we have this causal trend. But then this dashed line is just indicating these two variables are related. We don't know if they cause each other. We don't know kind of what's going on, but we know that, for whatever reason, the predictor of interest is associated with the confounder. People with different predictors of interest values are going to have different confounder values kind of on average throughout our data. So if we think of it in terms of in kind of the ice cream and shark attacks, what we're really interested in is looking at, how does ice cream, affect shark attacks? What's that kind of causal trend? But once we add weather to this, we have the ice cream, again, shark attacks, that's the line we want to measure right here. We're assuming that the weather causes shark attacks, again, kind of through that discussion of hotter weather, more people swimming, leads to higher shark attacks. So then the question really is, we're confident that there's an association between weather and ice cream. The question now is, what does this relationship kind of look like? And indeed, we think that this weather is causing ice cream, this weather is causing shark attacks. And once we kind of incorporate the role that weather has in this data, we then lose this sort of relationship between ice cream and shark attacks, right? That's at least kind of the thought behind it for this specific example. Sometimes this line still exists, but it's smaller. And again, in some times that line actually gets larger by including confounders. Again, confounding can work both ways. It can kind of amplify a relationship, or it can kind of minimize a relationship as well. But this is essentially what it would kind of look pictorially, and what we're really looking for confounding is really this association between our predictor and our confounder, and then the causal relationship between weather and shark attacks, that confounder and outcome, and then we conclude that this is a potential confounder in our data. And even though, often this is done theoretically, you can do checks in your data to kind of check, well, was ice cream and weather, were they actually associated in our data or not? And we can kind of check, okay, it looks like they're related. So our kind of initial assumptions were indeed correct, or at least not obviously wrong. But again, it's important to variables before you start looking in your data. These are really decisions you should say, these are the variables we want to look at as confounders, because I can kind of draw this figure here, and these variables fit this confounder role within this figure that I just drew. So it's really important to kind of think about this conceptually before we start actually diving into the numbers. So that's, again, kind of the, what is a confounder? Again, not textbook definition, but a little more formal than just talking about ice cream and sharks. So the next question is then, why should we even consider confounding? And hopefully this is clear from the ice cream and shark attacks example, but essentially we want to come as close as possible to a potential causal relationship in our data, right? We really want to hone in on what's the actual effect of some predictor on the outcome, and we want to remove kind of any potential bias for what that estimate could be. And these confounders, if we don't include them in our model, could lead to bias estimates for what that association looks like. Again, it could look like there's an association there when there's really not, or conversely, it might look like there's not an association when there really is. And by accounting for that confounder, we're able to see what that true relationship actually is between that predictor of interest and that outcome that we're looking for. And maybe this isn't needed, but why do we even care about the causal relationship? Why are we really interested in pinpointing a very specific relationship between variables? And the first is it really allows us to affect if a therapy or treatment is really, really effective. Is this actually something that's working, or is it just people who choose the treatment tend to do better no matter what, whether they had the treatment or not? So it really allows us to assess if a treatment or some other therapy is actually effective. And it also allows us to identify, potential targets for future treatment. If we know that there's some adverse event associated with a kind of, a specific injury characteristic, then we can say, okay, this is an injury characteristic that we might need to come up with a new treatment or a new therapy for, because by addressing that injury characteristic, we can hopefully eliminate any kind of adverse events or side effects, down the road. So it allows us to identify these kind of pathways that we can try to target with our treatment, target with our therapy, to make sure we can have kind of the best outcome as possible. But I just wanted to highlight the two of those because I think, maybe the assessing the treatment and therapy is obvious, but it's also important to know what a kind of true relationship is, even if it's not a specific treatment, if it's just some kind of exposure, to understand if this is something we can try to address with a treatment, or if this is something that really needs to be addressed in some other kind of pathway. So then the last question, we basically targeted the what the confounder is. It kind of leads to that spurious relationship or that lack of relationship. Why do we care? Because by addressing for confounding, we can get a more accurate estimate of the actual relationship we're interested in. And then, how do we actually address for confounding? I had mentioned in the, ice cream and shark attacks, if we have kind of complete control over a setting, we can kind of fix values to eliminate that potential confounding. And that's essentially what we're trying to do in clinical trials. So through study design, we can set up a study such that we're eliminating the possibility for confounding. And again, randomized clinical trials are the kind of the classic kind of gold standard for what that looks like. Essentially, by randomizing individuals to kind of treatment or control, there's no way that sort of other variables like age, sex, there's no way that any of those variables can be related to treatment because treatment's just randomly assigned. We should have the same characteristics in our treatment group as we do in the control group, again, because we're randomly assigning individuals, we're not allowing individuals to kind of choose for themselves and let that influence what they get. And again, we talked about one of the key criteria for a confounder is it has to be related with our predictor of interest. Again, if both groups have the same characteristics, there's no longer a relationship between treatment group and what those characteristics are. So by default, we no longer have any confounders because all those associations between our predictor of interest are gone through our study design, at least theoretically, right? I mean, if we could randomize an infinite number of people, this would be true. We have finite samples, particularly for small studies. Imbalances can still occur just by chance because you might not perfectly randomize the age. You might have one group slightly older, one group have slightly more, males, and there might be some of those slight imbalances just because, again, it's randomization. We don't have control over trying to balance that perfectly. Which leads to kind of the next way that we can address confounding, which is really through the statistical analysis. So this could be used if you did a clinical trial and you noticed that there are some imbalances still. We need to address some of those imbalances that didn't get kind of fixed the randomization the way we thought we were going to kind of correct them for. Or it could be, in the case of our data set here, the burn model systems, that a lot of this is observational kind of data. We're tracking individuals. We're not determining how badly somebody gets burned. We're not kind of assigning, okay, you're going to get a really bad burn and you're not going to get a bad burn. That's not what we're doing. We're just looking at kind of how these people come to us and kind of the treatment they're getting, and then tracking them over time and kind of looking at what their trajectories look like for their outcomes. So kind of either case, the statistical analysis holds. Again, observational data is essentially kind of needed for randomized clinical trials. It really comes down to, did the randomization do a good job of balancing the groups or not? If not, you may need to consider kind of additional approaches in the statistical analyses to correct for any of those imbalances. So in the statistical analysis, the way we generally account for confounding is essentially just included as another predictor in our model, and we often call it an adjustment variable. So we include it as an adjustment variable, but really we're just treating it as if we would any other predictor kind of mathematically in how we incorporate it in the model. And by including this confounder or potential confounder in the model, what we're really doing is we're effectively now comparing that association of interest between our predictor of interest and our outcome. We're comparing that association among individuals that have the same value of confounder. So again, among individuals of the same age, same race, same sex, we're now looking at what does that association look like. Again, ice cream and sharks, among days that have the same weather, as ice cream sales vary, how does that affect the number of shark attacks that we have? And by including, again, that kind of in the model, we're able to actually exert some control over that without having to have absolute control over the study design. We can't control the weather, but by including it in the model, we're basically trying to capture the same concept of we are now controlling for it in our model, even if we can't control for it in kind of the actual environment from which our data was collected. Just a few things of kind of caution with confounders, or maybe kind of misconceptions or ways they're potentially kind of misused. But one is that the significance in a model is really a poor metric of confounding. So a confounder can have a very kind of notable impact on a model, even if that variable isn't statistically significant, right? We're not really trying to assess, is this variable significantly associated with our outcome? We're trying to kind of correct for the bias this variable introduces, and that statistical significance, while it's a good indicator of if it's related to the outcome, it's not a good indicator of the bias it may be introducing if we do or do not include it in our model. So it's kind of important to note that when we're including confounding, we're not looking at if those variables are statistically significant. That's not a metric of confounding. That's a metric of specific association with that predictor, which again is different than what we're often kind of interested in when we're considering confounding. What you really want to look at is kind of a change in coefficients or a change in estimates for your predictor of interest. If your predictor of interest basically looks like it has the exact same association, whether you included a confounder or not, that variable is really not confounding that relationship, even if you thought it was going to kind of a priori. If you're seeing a big change in that estimate or that coefficient from regression model, then that indicates that there was kind of notable confounding presence and that we're seeing that big shift because there was some confounding that we are now accounting for by adding that variable. Often you're not even necessarily comparing across models to kind of check if the confounding was important or not. Often you just say scientifically we want to include this, and that's good enough. But if you are ever kind of considering is something a confounder or not based on kind of modeling, again, important to look at, how is it affecting the actual estimates? Don't focus as much on the actual significance of those values. And it's important to really kind of note that confounding really depends on your specific scientific question. So we're going to be kind of getting to this in one of the examples, but depending on your specific kind of question, even if the variables are all the same, you may or may not include certain variables as confounders based on the exact question that you want to answer. So it's going to be really important to really critically think about your very, very specific question you want answered and make sure you narrow it down as precisely as possible. If you keep it kind of big general, it's going to be really hard to determine whether a confounder should be included or not. And I had mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth noting again that confounding can also lead to kind of the spurious lack of association. Again, we often think of confounding causing a relationship to be present. Oh, we see this trend, but it's really caused by something else. But again, the opposite can happen. Kind of confounders can make associations disappear so that when we then adjust for it, we then see that true relationship appear. Kind of has a opposite effect to the true effect that then cancels out that true effect that's there. So it's just, again, really important to kind of note that as well. Confounding can go kind of both directions, and I think that's often kind of overlooked when we talk about the impact that confounding has on analyses. And lastly, just kind of some logistics in terms of modeling with confounders. So these are just some, I think, kind of questions I've seen when I was kind of a teaching assistant in graduate school for some courses. So I just kind of wanted to kind of highlight these from the kind of the front in case these are questions that other people have. But essentially, when we're including confounders in a model, mathematically, the model's not going to be able to distinguish between confounders and our predictor of interest. I think a lot of people kind of have the question of, well, how does our model know if something's a confounder versus the predictor we want? And the answer is the model doesn't know. It's all kind of the same to the model. We're essentially just giving it predictors, and the model's going to simultaneously estimate kind of everything. So mathematically, there's really no distinction between a confounder and our predictor of interest. Again, estimates are all simultaneously. So things like the order of the variables doesn't matter, right? We don't have to put our predictor of interest first. We don't have to put it last. We don't have to put it in the middle. It doesn't matter mathematically. Now, for reporting, it's often nice to have that predictor of interest maybe at the top or maybe the last variable to make it very, very easy to find. But mathematically, it really doesn't matter the order of the variables. It doesn't matter if you think it's a confounder. It doesn't matter if you think it's a predictor of interest. If the variables are in the model, you're going to get the same estimates kind of no matter what role you think they serve. But it is important to note that, even if the variable role isn't important kind of mathematically in getting these estimates, it is extremely important scientifically, right? Why you included a variable is very important to how you're going to interpret that model. So it's really important to kind of, again, come up with those theoretical models ahead of time and know what's the specific role these variables are going to have in your model. Again, not for mathematical reasons, but for the interpretation of those mathematical results that you get at the end. Again, for confounders, the focus isn't really interpreting what the impact of the confounder is on our outcome. What we are really doing is we're just including that confounder as a way to make sure that we're getting as accurate an estimate as possible for our predictor of interest. So our focus is often only on the predictor of interest, and the confounders are just there essentially as a way to ensure that estimate is accurate, not something that we're going to look at kind of in isolation on its own. So now I'm going to get into kind of a practical example. And again, this is kind of the area where I'm hoping to get kind of at least a little discussion, because I think there could be kind of very different thoughts on what people think of, based on their kind of experience, clinically with some of these variables. The big picture question that we're going to be looking at is, does one's biological race kind of impact body image in burn survivors? Our predictor of interest is really going to be this race, ethnicity. Sorry, that shouldn't be biological race. We are kind of incorporating kind of ethnicity as well. That should be biological will correspond to the sex that we're going to look at a little bit later. But this race ethnicity is going to be coded as, Hispanic versus white non-Hispanic versus other non-Hispanic, combining some of these categories just for kind of sample size reasons, admittedly losing a lot of that granularity and differences between some of these subgroups, but just kind of need to combine them to keep our sample size, reasonable. And then our outcome is going to be the burn-specific health scale with that really body image subscore as our outcome of interest. And then we're now going to focus on kind of, two additional variables that either should or should not be included in our model. Again, and this is the part we're hoping to kind of talk through, should these be included based on what we think? Are they confounders? Are they not confounders? So the variables we're going to be considering are biological sex and the total burn surface area at TBSA. So we're basically going to walk through and just kind of discuss, if our question of interest is, does race and ethnicity have a relationship with body image, should we be including these two variables in our model, or should we not? So the first question, again, is, should we be including sex in our model? So again, the relationship we're really interested in is race and ethnicity and how that potentially leads to body image. So now the question is, again, do we need to kind of account for sex? So I'll keep it open-ended right now, and then kind of depending on responses or non-responses, I'll kind of maybe guide specific questions that we'll need to answer. So if anyone's brave enough to kind of volunteer, should we adjust for sex and provide kind of just a very brief explanation as to why or why not you think it should be included in the model, that'd be fantastic. Yes, Carla, go ahead.
Sure, I'll be the brave one. I would say you would want to include it in the model because there may be different sexes may have an impact on body image. Like there might be a direct relationship there, and that you might see different levels of that across your predictor variable of race and ethnicity.
Yeah, so we have that, right, that kind of potential relationship between, do I have it on the list? I'll have that one first. But potentially we have kind of this relationship between sex and body image that's, again, plausible. Can we check it? No. And other people might have different beliefs, but being able to kind of state, I think this relationship could potentially hold. Therefore, I think this is how we should treat it. Again, that's kind of the important part of this discussion. So what about the relationship between race and ethnicity and sex? Do we think that relates? Because we also need that kind of relationship present as well. Do we think that there's a relationship there potentially or not? And again, different people could have different justifications for why or why not. There's not, I think it's important to kind of establish there's not a right answer for kind of yes or no. It's going to come down to, again, based on your experience, do you think that's there or not? I'll present kind of my initial take on it, but again, it's not the absolute answer. It's just based on my theoretical thoughts. Here's what I thought. But yeah, what do people think about race and ethnicity and sex? Could there be a relationship, or do we think there's probably no relationship there?
I can jump in, Andrew, if nobody else does. I guess I would not see that there is a relationship between sex and race and ethnicity. I guess I wouldn't theoretically think of there being a relationship there. Yeah,
and my thought, I'll kind of give my thought. My thought was there potentially could be in the burn specific population, and in the general population, I think not. In this one, maybe just based on cultural norms, there's different kind of gender roles. Some of them are more prone to burns than others, so maybe some of them are kind of over sampled in the. Again, it's also possible not. Like this is not my definitive. My answer is not the definitive answer by any means, but again, I think this is a good example of the discussion that needs to be had. Somebody said, they think it isn't. Somebody said they think it is, and then being able to have kind of a discussion and kind of decide, do we think this relationship is present or not? Are we confident enough as a group that we need to include this or not? But I think this kind of exactly represents the discussion that needs to be had, and how, again, different people from different areas of knowledge are going to approach this kind of very differently in the discussion. For the sake of the model I'm going to present, since I already ran the analysis, I'm going to assume there is a relationship there. But again, if you don't assume that, we just could adjust that model kind of down the road. But I'm not going to try to update that live for you. But so just kind of be aware that that is the assumption I'm going to make moving forward. But I think this whole discussion on whether it is or there is, again, exactly that conversation that needs to be had. And again, people might disagree with this as well, but I imagine there's probably less pushback on sex being, potentially kind of related to body image, and that in particular, sex could cause differences in body image. Kind of just through upbraiding societal pressures, that your sex kind of through that whole pathway is then going to kind of alter your body image kind of perception. So again, other people may be able to argue that, and that's perfectly fine. But I think that one's maybe a little more kind of airtight than kind of this relationship between race and ethnicity and sex. So another question is, what about burn area? So again, we're interested in the same ultimate question: race and ethnicity. Does that affect body image? What about burn area? What do people think? Again, either do you think it should be included or not, or what are your thoughts on a specific relationship, either with race and ethnicity or with body image? Do we think that there is potential relationships, and do we need to adjust for this? Let's start with maybe body image. Do people think, as your burn area gets larger, do we think that potentially either increases or decreases someone's kind of perception of their body image? Could that trend exist, or do we think there's kind of no way that burn area could have any impact on body image?
I think we should probably adjust for TBSA.
I was a little faint. Would you mind saying that again?
I'm just saying, I do think we should adjust for TBSA.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it's certainly not the only thing that's going to affect body image about an injury characteristic, but I think it's not unreasonable to think that a larger burn area maybe tend to be more visible, which may make somebody kind of more self-conscious, which could potentially affect, their body image. So I think there's a plausible way to believe that burn injury size could impact body image. Again, by no means the only, factor. Location and stuff are also, very, very important, but there could be kind of a relationship there. And then the other question, if we think we should adjust for this, would be, is burn area and race and ethnicity related? And again, possibly, different cultural norms, different kind of, the things in terms of exposure is, cooking over a fire versus electric. I mean, maybe that's not a race thing, but I know there's this kind of strong opinions over the, the best kind of cooking surface, and what cooking surface you have could affect, your likelihood of getting burned or not. Again, whether that there is a kind of a racial component or ethnicity component to kind of what, cooking surface area you prefer, I don't know. But you could potentially imagine that there is, some kind of trend between kind of exposure based on kind of how you grew up and kind of what you were kind of exposed to as a child and kind of what you then prefer. So I think it could be feasible to adjust for this. This one I did want to kind of dive into a little more because I think it's going to be really important to, again, critically think about what specific question do we want to actually kind of account for. So here I just left it kind of very vague as, does race and ethnicity affect body image? But the question I think really needs to be fine-tuned a little bit to get at, should we actually adjust for this burn surface area, or should we kind of omit it from the model because of the specific question we want? So I allude to this, I think, very, very, very early in one of the slides, that we have to be careful with the confounder. Question here: could you explain the difference between acknowledging a confounder versus controlling for a variable? I would say that confounder is a very specific type of variable we want to control for. So I tend to think of, if we're controlling for a variable, it's any variable we're including in a model, but that we're not directly interested in. And confounder is one example of that, where we're specifically including a confounder as a controlling variable to make sure our association is unbiased. But there are other types of variables, which I'm not discussing here, but I can briefly talk about it. But one is called often called a precision variable, where essentially the variable is associated with our outcome, but is not associated at all with our predictor of interest. So essentially, kind of the alternative explanation for this relationship was, if there is no relationship between sex and race and ethnicity, we could still include it as a controlling variable in our model. But if this association is non-existent, it's no longer a confounder. We'd often consider it more of a precision variable, which kind of improves the accuracy of our model, but doesn't change the actual estimate of the relationship between race, ethnicity, and body image. So I would kind of say a confounder is always a variable we want to control for, but there are other types of kind of controlling variables that we need to account for. And I'd also say confounder is often associated with the variable itself, whereas a kind of controlling for a variable is the act of addressing the issue of kind of that variable. So I'd also kind of add the slight distinction between kind of sort of confounder, sort of a noun, and that controlling is kind of more that verb, more that action we take to address something that is identified as a confounder. And if that's not clear, or you have any follow-up questions, just let me know. But kind of going back to this, should we really be adjusting for TBSA? Really coming down to, what's the specific question that we're really, really interested in? If we're interested in any effect of race and ethnicity, and we think that somebody's, race and ethnicity, somehow leads to kind of causing, potential burn surface areas, again, potentially kind of what types of things you're exposed to in your house, if there's some sort of relationship there, then we want to be really critical of, again, what is the exact effect we have? If we want the total effect of race and ethnicity, well, this is one avenue in which race and ethnicity could affect body image. And if we're not interested in kind of distinguishing specific pathways, we just want, is there any effect at all? We don't care how we get there. We want to omit this kind of burn surface area, because then this association that goes through this potential confounder is then attributed to this impact between race, ethnicity, and body image as a total effect, right? This is one kind of line of path to body image, so we want to combine all that into one specific effect. Again, if our question was any effect, in this case, we would not want to adjust for burn surface area, because it's essentially removing part of the way that race does impact body image. Essentially, we want that whole causal pathway. We want every single path that goes from race to body image. We don't care how you get there. As long as it causes it, we want to capture it into one precise estimate. So again, we do not want to adjust for it if it's in the causal pathway, because we want to capture all different possible ways in which that association and that causal pathway exists. If we added TBSA, this would remove that indirect effect, and we'd no longer be capturing kind of the total effect in our estimated association. We'd be capturing the effect minus the indirect effect through that total burn surface area. Kind of contrasting that with, if we kind of refine our question a little more, rather than just any effect, we're now interested in, what's the direct effect of race and ethnicity? I'm not looking at any effect across any avenues. I'm looking at a very, very specific effect that's only this direct arrow from race and ethnicity to body image. In that case, we want to eliminate this causal pathway from our estimate, because we only want to capture the precise estimate for this specific pathway, not all the pathways from race to body image. So by including TBSA, we can effectively eliminate this causal pathway, and we're left with only an estimate of the actual pathway that we're actually interested in. So in this case, again, we would want to adjust for that burn surface area if it is in the causal pathway, because our question is asking about a very, very specific pathway. It's not just an overall pathway, it's a very specific pathway that we want to try to estimate. And by adding that burn surface area, it really allows us to see if that race and ethnicity is associated with body image among individuals who had similar burn surface areas. So we're no longer considering that, race could potentially somehow be causally related to burn surface area. We're saying we're going to, essentially what we want to do conceptually is fix the burn surface area and then see if race is going to have an impact on body image or not. So again, we started with the same kind of initial question of, does race and ethnicity have an impact with body image? But by narrowing the focus of that question to a very, very specific kind of question, again, whether we're interested in any and all effects or whether we're interested in a very direct effect, it has a very big impact on whether we include something as a confounder or not. So again, it's really important, again, when thinking about kind of research questions, to take that broad question and really narrow it down to, are you just interested in anything, that kind of any sort of pathway where two variables are related, or do you want to isolate specific pathways and say, no, I can attribute this here, I can attribute this here, I can attribute this effect here, and kind of break it down. So really kind of keep that in mind whenever you're considering whether a confounder should be included or not. It really comes down to what's your question of interest, and again, how do all these kind of pathways interplay? If this arrow was going the opposite direction or it wasn't causal, then we want to include it kind of regardless, because it doesn't really represent an effect of race and ethnicity on body image, because race and ethnicity in that case would not cause the burn surface area, which then would cause body image. So because it's not in the causal pathway, we need to address it no matter what, because it's not a direct effect and it's not an indirect effect. We do not want to map that pathway. It needs to be adjusted. But because it's in the causal pathway in this diagram, we need to make that kind of decision. Are we interested in the direct, or are we interested in the total effect that race may have on body image? That was kind of the bulk of, I guess, kind of the thought process for trying to talk through confounders. I know it was kind of going through somewhat fast and kind of introducing kind of that new topic of in the causal pathway or not. So I just want to stop here and just see if there are any questions. This last component is just basically kind of showing the model results to see how values differ, but it's not as pivotal to kind of understanding confounding, and not as pivotal in understanding kind of the conversation that needs to be had when determining if something should be considered a confounder or not. So just want to take a brief pause in case there are any questions here that would be helpful for me to address before just kind of showing a snapshot of the results from kind of that final model that I had settled on. All right, hearing none, then I'll just kind of jump to kind of the results. So again, I kind of made a few assumptions. I presented the kind of the graphs that I used for this model, but again, those graphs are not the be all end all. Again, working with collaborators, you might determine those graphs look different and you have to adjust that model accordingly. But for the analysis I'm presenting, I'm assuming that we're really most interested in the direct effect of race and ethnicity. So we're really most interested in sort of this figure here. We want to eliminate sort of this pathway here. So we do need to address that total burn surface area as a confounder. We do need to control for that in the model. And then similarly, I'm assuming there's an association between sex and race based on the figure I presented. But again, based on kind of, whatever diagram you set up, you may choose to include or not to include those variables as well. We can go ahead and build that model. Generally, you're not going to present sort of a model with and without confounders. Generally, you say, we have the confounders for a reason, so we're going to have them in the model, and that's the one model you'll present. I'm going to include kind of both of them here just to see kind of, the impact and kind of highlight what to look for between the models. But generally, you'd have just kind of that one model that includes the confounders that you had determined a priori. But our model without, I was about to include the outcome there, but the model without confounders, our outcome is the body image, predictor is that race and ethnicity, and then the results, compared to white non-Hispanics, we found that Hispanics had, body image scores 0.28 units higher, so essentially had kind of, better body image by 0.28 units. And then that non-white non-Hispanics tended to have, lower impressions of their body image, 0.19 units lower. However, neither finding was significant. So neither of these findings were significant, but we did descriptively, we saw these trends that Hispanics tended to have higher body image, better body image compared to white non-Hispanics, but non-white non-Hispanics tend to have a lower body image compared to white non-Hispanics. We can then look at the model, with confounders. Again, the outcome should be body image. Our predictors are now race and ethnicity, and that's our predictor of interest. We also are now adding sex, and we're also adding that total burn surface area. And again, the model does not know and does not care sort of what role these variables, have. Even though I, as kind of the researcher, have race and ethnicity as my predictor of interest and sex and TBSA as my potential confounders, from the modeling perspective, these are all on the same footing. These are all predictors. It doesn't matter kind of the order or how we include them in the model. It's just going to treat them all the same. Those estimates are all going to occur simultaneously. If we look at the results now, we see that Hispanics had scores, 0.26 units higher, whereas non-white non-Hispanics had scores 0.15 units lower when compared to white non-Hispanics. And again, neither finding here was significant as well. So we were not seeing any change in the significance, but we did see some slight change in the coefficients. Looking at this, The estimate for Hispanics was relatively unchanged. It was 0.28 to 0.26. That's a pretty small change in that coefficient. But if we're looking at the estimate for non-white non-Hispanics compared to white non-Hispanics, we're seeing that coefficient actually changed by over 20%. So we are definitely seeing a shift in what that value is. Even though we didn't see a change in the significance, we did see a notable change in what that coefficient value is. It doesn't change overall conclusions. Is that large enough to be clinically impactful? Maybe not. So maybe this wasn't the most impactful confounder, but that 20% change does indicate that some confounding was present, particularly for the relationship between kind of non-white non-Hispanics and white non-Hispanics and body image. The other thing to note here is I have not looked at sex. I have not looked at burn surface area. I have not reported those estimates, again, because we don't care. We're not interested in what those estimates are. They're included in the model to give us the best possible and most accurate estimate for the relationship between race and ethnicity and body image, but we're not directly interested in the relationship between sex and body image and TBSA and body image for this particular research question. Just a quick summary, we found that, not addressing confounding can really lead to spurious associations in our analyses. And again, that can be an association that's present, or it can be kind of the lack of association. That can both be spurious, and that we really need to adjust for that confounding to get that true association, which either could appear or disappear depending on kind of what our data looks like. We can account for confounding by including it as an adjustment variable in our model, which effectively allows us to make comparisons while conceptually holding that variable fixed. Essentially just allows us, again, to compare groups that have similar values for that confounder. Even if we're not kind of controlling that variable through data collection, we're controlling through our model. And the last point to kind of really drive home is that confounding really is specific to a scientific question, and it's specific to scientific beliefs in terms of kind of how you think causal pathways are operating, where you think associations exist and don't. So it's really important to kind of critically think through this and have a discussion about how you think these variables may impact other variables to determine if it needs to be included as a confounder, or if it's something you want to omit because you're looking at a very specific type of relationship that you want to capture. And that is all I have. I think thankfully, a few minutes for questions. I was hoping to have just a little bit of time just in case. But yeah, if there are any questions here, happy to take them now. Also happy for people to kind of reach out after if there are any questions down the road about any of this. But yeah, just opening up to any questions regarding anything confounding, whether it was presented here or whether it's a question I did not address that you're curious about. Happy to answer. I'm not seeing any questions. I'm kind of going to give a few seconds in case anyone's typing in the chat, but also a chance to have kind of a statistician on the hot seat too. So I guess if there are questions outside of confounding, that could be kind of helpful. I'm happy to kind of just address any general questions if there's any kind of curiosity, if there's no specific questions for confounding.
Andrew, I guess I just wanted to pipe up. I think this is fantastic and really helpful. I guess in terms of the burn model system, I think there are, things that can be confounders that maybe we don't think of just because of the way the data was collected or the way different sites do things. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that it's good to have a conversation with us and with co-investigators when you're deciding your research question, just because maybe things you don't think of as confounders could also appear as confounders just because of the nature of our data set.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, excellent point. That, again, right, can just kind of tapping that knowledge that this is really, determining confounders, again, people coming from different knowledge kind of bases are going to have different kind of opinions on what should be. And, data collectors versus clinicians versus, people at the data center versus people around the analyses are all going to have slightly different approaches. So kind of the more that can be a conversation, the more I might identify a variable that you didn't think was a confounder. You might identify variables I didn't think was a confounder. So to be able to kind of utilize each other as kind of that resource to kind of have that conversation again, in the data center for the, BMS personnel, as somebody who kind of has a unique perspective on that data and how it's collected, can be helpful in kind of filling in potential gaps that are maybe less clear for somebody who's kind of more maybe in the field with it. And I was also just chiming that, inevitably we're always going to miss confounders, whether, like we're not going to be able to collect, every possible confounder out there. So I think it's just also important to, we do the best job we can to address confounders. And certainly, if we have the data to do it, we should account for them. But there's always going to be, confounders that we're kind of omitting. And that's always kind of an important limitation of kind of most of these analyses, is that there's variables we just can't collect that are probably having some impact. So just kind of be aware of that, that's often present in any analysis, is kind of the unmeasurable confounding that we just don't have access to. Other questions or comments?
Looks like we might not have any more questions. So thanks very much, Andrew. That was really helpful. And I will be posting this on our website, and we'll have more webinars in the future. So thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.